Show more. I have $52, a half-empty coffee pot, and 1 week before they take everything I've ever built. And somehow tonight I'm still turning on the lights. She almost didn't, but Emily Carter had never once left that sign dark without reason, and she wasn't about to let bankruptcy be the first. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, please subscribe to this channel and follow Emily's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The coffee pot had been gurgling for 11 years inside Silver Ridge Diner, and Emily Carter knew every sound it made, the way a mother knows her child's breathing. There was the morning gurgle, slow, reluctant, almost lazy, and the afternoon gurgle, which was faster, more urgent, like it had somewhere to be. But the sound it made on the night of January the 14th was different from both of those. It was thin, tired, like it was running on memory rather than water. Emily stood behind the counter and listened to it and thought, well, that makes two of us. She had counted the money 3 times already, $52.37 if she included the coins she'd scraped from the bottom of her coat pocket. She had laid it all out on the counter in neat little stacks, the way her mother had taught her when she was 8 years old, and they were doing the family budget on the kitchen table in Billings. Her mother used to say that money looked less scary when it was organized. Emily had believed that for a long time. She didn't believe it anymore. Organized or not, $52 looked exactly like what it was the end. The foreclosure notice was taped to the inside of her office door. She didn't need to read it again. She had it memorized by now, every cold bureaucratic line of it, the date, the amount owed, the name of the bank officer who had signed it with what she imagined was a perfectly steady hand. 7 days. That was what she had. 7 days before Silver Ridge Diner became somebody else's problem or somebody else's opportunity or just another empty building on a Montana highway that nobody drove anymore since they'd rerouted the interstate 3 years back. She picked up her coffee mug and took a long sip and looked out through the front window at the snow. It had started around 4 in the afternoon, just flurries at first. The kind that locals ignored, but by 6 it had turned mean. By 7 it was a full whiteout, the kind of storm that the Weather Service gave names to and that old ranchers talked about for decades afterward. The highway was invisible. The parking lot was invisible. The sign out front, Silver Ridge Diner open, 24 HRS home cooking, was almost invisible, just a faint orange glow somewhere out in the white. Emily had stayed open anyway. She always stayed open. It was the one thing she had never compromised on, not through her divorce, not through her mother's passing, not through the rerouting of the highway that had taken 60% of her business in a single year. Silver Ridge Diner was open 24 hours because people needed a place to go, and Emily Carter was going to be that place for as long as she possibly could, which at this particular moment appeared to be about 7 more days. She was washing the same coffee mug for the 3rd time just to have something to do with her hands when she heard it. It started low, a vibration more than a sound, something she felt in her chest before her ears registered it. She set the mug down slowly, stood still, listened. Engines. Not one engine, not 2, many. She moved to the window and pressed her face close to the glass and tried to see through the snow, and for a moment she thought she was imagining it, that the storm had gotten inside her head and was playing tricks on her. Then the headlights appeared. First one pair, then another, pouring through the snow like something out of a dream she wasn't sure was good or bad. They came off the highway in a long, rumbling line and pulled into her parking lot, and Emily stood at the window with both hands pressed flat against the glass and her breath fogging the cold surface, and she counted. 1, 15, 20 motorcycles in her parking lot in a blizzard. At 8:30 on a Tuesday night in January, she stepped back from the window. Her first thought was completely practical. She did not have enough food to feed 20 people. She had half a pot of chili, some bread, eggs, a little bacon, coffee. Her last supplied delivery had been 6 days ago, and she hadn't ordered another because she wasn't sure she'd still be open when it arrived. Her second thought came right on the heels of the first, and it was not practical at all. It was something closer to fear. Because even through the snow and the dark, she could see what kind of motorcycles those were. She could see the size of the men climbing off them. And when the first one reached the door, and she saw the patches on his jacket, the death's head, the words arcing above and below it, she felt her stomach drop to somewhere around her knees. Hell's Angels. 20 Hells Angels, in her parking lot, in a blizzard. The door handle rattled. Emily didn't move. She stood behind the counter with her hand resting on the edge of it, and she looked out the door and she made herself think clearly, which was something she had always been good at in a crisis, and which she was finding considerably harder to do right now. They're cold, she told herself. Whatever else they are, they're cold. It's 8 degrees outside, and they've been on those bikes in a blizzard, and they're cold. The handle rattled again. Then a fist knocked on the glass, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and a voice came through the door, muffled by the storm, but unmistakably a man's voice, deep and rough as gravel. Lady, we can see you standing there. We're not here to cause trouble. We just need to get out of this storm. Emily exhaled one long breath, walked to the door, unlocked it. The man who came through first was enormous. 6'4", maybe taller, with a beard that had ice crystals in it, and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale gray cold but not unkind. He ducked his head slightly to clear the door frame, even though he didn't need to, which struck Emily as oddly courteous. His jacket said President across the top rocker, and beneath the death's head, it is said Jack Lawson. But the name she saw written below, that in smaller letters, was the name she'd later learn everyone called him by. Reaper. He stepped inside and looked around the diner, the empty booths, the counter, the coffee pot, the woman standing alone behind it, and then he looked back at her and he said, "Just us in the storm tonight." "Just you in the storm," Emily said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "How many?" 20. "We'll sit wherever you want us. And if you want us to leave, say so, and we'll go find somewhere else." He paused. "Though I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure there is anywhere else." She looked past him at the men filing in behind him. Big men, road-worn men, men with cold cracked knuckles and frost on their beards, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a blizzard for hours. One of them was lean. Another had a cut on his forearm that had soaked through his sleeve. A third, the youngest, barely more than a boy, really was shaking so hard his teeth were clicking together. "Sit down," Emily said. "All of you. I'll put more coffee on." Jack Lawson looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't quite read in those pale eyes. Then he nodded once, a slow, serious nod. "Thank you," he said. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. She turned back to the counter and started moving, because moving was the only thing that kept her from thinking too hard about what she'd just done. The first pot of coffee disappeared in under 4 minutes. Emily didn't say anything. She just made another one. She set mugs in front of each of the men, 20 mugs, which took every clean mug she owned, and 2 she had to quickly wash, and she poured without being asked, and she didn't make them wait. "What do you have?" Jack asked from the end stool. He'd settled at the counter rather than a booth, which she appreciated. It kept him close where she could see him, and it meant he wasn't turning his back on her. "Half pot of chili, eggs, bacon, bread." She said it straight, no apology, no inflation. "It's not much, I wasn't expecting company." He nodded. "What's a full meal run?" $12 covers eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. "We'll take 20 of whatever you can make stretch." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded stack of bills without counting them. "Set it on the counter." Emily didn't look at it. "And whatever you think is fair beyond that," he added, "for the inconvenience." "It's not an inconvenience," she said, and she picked up the stack of bills and set it in the register without counting it either. "That's the wrong word for what this is." He tilted his head slightly. "What's the right word?" She thought about it for a moment. "Company," she said. "Oh, it's been a quiet night." Something shifted in his face at that, not quite a smile, but close. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and turned slightly on his stool and looked out at his men, who were filling the booths, unwinding scarves and gloves, thawing out finger by finger in the warmth of the diner. Emily went to the kitchen and started cooking. She had a system. She'd had it for 11 years, and it had never failed her. The bacon went on first because it took longest, and while it cooked, she cracked eggs 12 at a time. And she sliced bread and got the toaster loaded, and she moved from station to station in her kitchen, the way a conductor moves through an orchestra, everything in sequence, everything with a purpose. The chili she stretched with the last of her canned tomatoes and some dried beans she found in the back of the pantry. It wasn't the same chili she'd made fresh 3 days ago, but it was hot, and it was seasoned, right, and it would do. She was plating the 3rd round of eggs when she heard the voice. Not Jack's voice. A younger voice, coming from just outside the kitchen door, which she'd left propped open. "Hey, you need help in there." She turned. The young one, the shaking one, was standing in the doorway. He'd taken off his jacket and the Hells Angels t-shirt. Underneath it was damp with melted snow. He was maybe 23, 24. Dark eyes, dark circles under them. The shaking had mostly stopped, but his hands were still unsteady. I can cook, he said. I'm not just saying that, I actually can. Emily looked at him for a moment. You know how to work a flat-top grill? Yes, ma'am. She stepped to the side. Bacon's done. Start the next round of eggs. 4 minutes on each side of the toast. He came into the kitchen without another word and picked up the spatula and got to work, and Emily watched him for exactly 30 seconds to make sure he knew what he was doing, and then she turned back to her own station. They worked side by side in silence for a few minutes. Then he said, without looking up from the grill, My name's Danny. Emily. I know, he said. I mean, I saw the sign outside. Emily's Silver Ridge Diner. He paused. You've had this place a long time. 11 years. That's a long time. It is, she said. She was slicing more bread. What happened to your hand? He glanced down at his right hand, where she'd noticed a thin white scar running from the base of his thumb across his palm. Old thing, he said. Not bike-related. She didn't push. Some doors you knocked on, and some you walked past, and she'd learned over 11 years behind a counter to tell the difference. They worked in silence for another few minutes. Then Danny said very quietly, still not looking up, I've never been to Montana before. Where are you from? Wyoming originally. Been a lot of places since. How long have you been with the club? 2 years. He flipped an egg with more precision than she expected. Jack vouched for me. Wouldn't be here otherwise. She glanced toward the dining room where she could hear the low rumble of conversation building as the men thawed out and the coffee took hold. He seems like a man people take seriously. He is, Danny said. Then after a pause, he's also the reason I'm still alive. Emily set down her bread knife, looked at him. I wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the grill, but his jaw was tight and she could see something working behind those dark eyes, something heavy and real. You don't have to tell me, she said. I know. He was quiet for a long moment, but I think maybe I should. He told her in pieces, between plates going out and coffee being refilled. The way people tell the hardest truths sideways a little at a time, like they're testing whether the air can hold it. 3 years ago, he said, before the club. He'd been drifting, that was the word he used, drifting with a look on his face that had suggested it was a kindness to call it that, sleeping in his truck, running out of everything, money, options, reasons. He'd ended up on this highway, he said, right here, this stretch of road in the middle of Montana in the dead of winter. Emily went very still. There was a diner, Danny said. I don't remember the name. I barely remember anything about that night, honestly. I remember pulling into the lot because I didn't know where else to go. And I remember going inside because it was warm. And I remember he stopped, took a breath. A woman brought me food I hadn't eaten in 2 days. She just brought it. Didn't ask me to order, didn't ask me for anything. Just set a plate in front of me and poured me coffee and acted like it was the most normal thing in the world. Emily's hands had stopped moving. I ate, Danny said, and something about that, just being fed, just being treated like a person, something about it reached me in a way that nothing else had. I'd been sitting in that truck for 3 hours trying to work up the nerve to drive it off the ridge road. He said it plainly, without drama, without looking for a reaction. I'd made up my mind, and then I went in, and a woman gave me food and coffee and talked to me like I was worth talking to, and he exhaled. I changed my mind. The kitchen was very quiet. I don't know if she ever knew, Danny said. I left before I could figure out how to say it. But I never forgot her. Blonde, tired eyes, wore a plain apron. He finally looked up from the grill and looked at Emily. I've been in a lot of diners since then. Looking, I think, without really knowing I was looking. Emily stood with a plate in each hand and looked at this young man across the grill and felt the world tilt very slightly on its axis. It was me, she said. He blinked. 3 years ago, she said, a young man in a truck. He was sitting in the back corner booth by himself and she paused. He looked like he was carrying something too heavy for one person. I brought him the blue plate special, and I told him the soup was particularly good that night, even though it wasn't especially, and he left before I could check on him again. Danny stared at her. He didn't say anything. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the heat from the grill. I thought about him for weeks afterward, Emily said softly. I wondered if he was okay. Danny set the spatula down very carefully on the edge of the grill. He pressed both hands flat on the counter and bowed his head and took one long, shaking breath. Okay, he said finally. His voice was rough. I'm okay. They got the food out. Emily carried plates and Danny carried plates, and the men ate the way men eat when they're genuinely hungry, seriously, gratefully, without a lot of conversation. The chili got a round of low murmurs of approval. The bacon disappeared so fast she went back and started another pound before anyone asked. She was refilling cups down the counter when the man 2 stools from Jack caught her eye. He was older than most of the others, mid-60s, silver-haired, with the build of someone who'd once been very powerful and had carried it into age with a certain dignity. He had his hands wrapped around his mug, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. You've been running this place alone long, he said. Long enough, she said. She topped off his cup. My name's Hector, he said. Hector Reyes. People call me Ghost. Emily Carter. He nodded slowly. Carter, he repeated, like he was filing it somewhere. This place has been here a while, hasn't it? The sign out front looks old, she said. Yes, I keep meaning to update it. I drove this highway, Ghost said. About 12 years back, maybe 13. I was in bad shape. Not physically, just, he tapped his chest once. In here. I just lost my wife. Didn't know what I was doing on that road or any road. Any road. Stopped here because my gas gauge was sitting on empty. He looked around the diner. Woman behind the counter talked to me for about an hour. Wouldn't let me pay for the coffee. Said people who were driving in grief didn't pay for coffee. That was the rule. Emily said very carefully. I've always had that rule. Ghost looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. I could tell by the way you said it that you remember saying it. I do, she said. I remember you too. You had your wedding ring on your right hand. You just moved it. Ghost's jaw worked. He looked down at his right hand where the ring was still there, worn now. The gold a little thinner, but still there. I drove off that lot, he said, and I felt, I don't have a better word for it, human. For the first time in months, I felt like a human being. He shook his head slowly. 13 years and I never forgot. Emily gripped the coffee pot handle a little tighter, because the room was starting to move around her in a way she didn't entirely trust. By 10 o'clock, the storm had gotten worse. Jack had gone outside to check the highway. Nothing moving, not even the county plows, and had come back in and told the room they were staying until it cleared. No argument from anyone. He'd come back to his stool at the counter and watched Emily work for a while without saying anything, and then he said, "You're not afraid of us." It wasn't a question exactly, it was more like an observation delivered with a certain careful neutrality. Emily set down the rag she'd been using to wipe the counter. Should I be? A lot of people are. A lot of people haven't been running a diner alone for 11 years, she said. You learn pretty fast that fear is not a useful tool. It doesn't help you make a decision, and it doesn't help you make dinner, so you put it down. He looked at her steadily. What do you do instead? Pay attention, she said. You pay attention to what's actually in front of you, not what you're afraid might be. She picked the rag back up. What's in front of me is 20 men who are cold and hungry and stuck in a storm. That's all. Something crossed his face, respect maybe, or recognition. Your place, he said after a moment, looking around the diner. The sign out front says 24 hours. Always has. Business good. She laughed once short and without much humor. They rerouted the interstate 3 years ago, took most of my traffic with it. She said it matter-of-factly. I've got 7 days. He went very still. 7 days. Foreclosure, she said. The word felt different out loud than it did in her head. Smaller somehow. More manageable. Bank officer's been very polite about it. Jack said nothing for a moment. He looked at her, then he looked around the diner again, the booths full of his men, the coffee steam rising the yellowed photographs on the wall, the hand-lettered daily specials board, and his face was doing something she couldn't quite read. What would it take, he said. What do you mean, to save it? What's the number? Emily looked at him. Mr. Lawson, Jack. Jack. She folded the rag in half, set it on the counter. I appreciate what you're... I'm not being charitable, he said. I'm asking a business question. What's the number? She looked at him for another long moment. Something in his voice made her answer. A little over 70,000 between the back payments and the penalties and the okay, Jack said, just that, okay. Then he stood up from the stool, his full height, which was considerable, and he reached into his jacket and he pulled out his phone and he looked at it for a moment and then he walked to the far end of the diner by the jukebox that hadn't worked since 2019 and he started making calls. Emily watched him go. Then she turned back to the counter and picked up the coffee pot and started making the rounds again because the coffee was getting low and her hands needed something to do, and she was not going to let herself think not yet about what any of this meant. 3 booths down, a biker with a neck tattoo and a surprisingly gentle face looked up at her as she poured and said, "You know what's funny?" "What's that?" she said. "Jack doesn't make calls for people," he said. "I've been in this club 8 years. I've never seen him make calls for a stranger." Emily looked toward the far end of the diner where Jack Lawson stood with his back to the room, phone pressed to his ear, his voice too low to hear. "Maybe," she said carefully, "I'm not entirely a stranger." The biker with the neck tattoo looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Danny, who was coming out of the kitchen with more bread. Then he looked back at Emily. "No," he said slowly, "I don't think you are." Outside, the storm howled and pushed against the windows, and the snow piled higher on the parking lot and the highway beyond. And in Silver Ridge Diner, 20 men drank coffee and ate everything Emily Carter had left in her kitchen, and Jack Lawson stood by a broken jukebox making phone calls in a quiet, steady voice, and nobody in that room yet knew what was coming. But the night was still young, and sometimes the world waits until your very last moment to show you what it's been building all along. Jack came back from that jukebox at 11:17. Emily knew the exact time because she'd been watching the clock above the pie case the way you watch a clock when you're waiting for something you can't name, not impatiently, just aware. Aware that something was in motion, that the air in the room had changed in the last hour the way air changes before a storm breaks, and this particular storm wasn't the one outside. He sat back down on his stool, set his phone face down on the counter, picked up his coffee mug and found it empty and didn't say anything about it, just held it in both hands, the way people hold empty things when their mind is somewhere else entirely. Emily poured without being asked. He looked up. "Thank you." "You made a lot of calls," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "Anyone answer?" He looked at her steadily. Everyone answered. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she set the coffee pot down and leaned one hip against the counter and crossed her arms and waited. Because she had learned over 11 years of running a diner that the best way to get the rest of a story was to be quiet and let it arrive on its own schedule. Jack turned his mug in a slow circle on the counter, turned it again. Then he said, "You told me 70,000. Approximately, yes. I need you to write the exact number down." He pushed a napkin across the counter with 2 fingers, set a pen on top of it. "The exact number, what you owe the bank, the penalties, everything." Emily looked at the napkin, looked at the pen. "Jack, I know what you're going to say. Then you know I can't accept. You're going to say you can't accept charity from strangers," he said, and his voice was level and patient and entirely immovable. "And I'm going to tell you 2 things. First, we've already established that you're not exactly a stranger to most of the men in this room." He glanced down the counter to where Ghost was still sitting, turning his coffee mug in his hands in almost the exact same unconscious motion. "Second, this isn't charity." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What is it then?" "It's a debt," he said simply, "being paid." The diner was noisy enough, low conversations, the scrape of forks, someone laughing at something at the far booth that the moment felt strangely private, despite being surrounded by 20 people. Emily looked at this man she had known for approximately 3 hours and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, something more structural than hope. Something that felt like the ground reasserting itself under her feet. She picked up the pen, pulled the napkin toward her, wrote the number down, the full number, with all its ugly decimal places, and pushed it back across the counter. Jack looked at it. His expression didn't change. He folded the napkin and put it in his breast pocket and went back to his coffee, and that was the end of that conversation. Except it wasn't, of course. Emily knew it wasn't. She just didn't know yet what came next. She was about to find out. At 11:43, the door opened. Not a knock this time, just the door swinging open on the cold, and a man came in, shaking snow off his shoulders, late 50s, heavy set with a Harley-Davidson patches on his jacket that were different from the ones the others wore. He wasn't Hell's Angels. He was something else, some other chapter of some other world Emily didn't know the geography of. He came straight to the counter, straight to Jack, and they gripped hands the way men grip hands when there's real history between them. Made it, the man said. Told you the road was passable if you took the county route, Jack said. Barely. The man looked at Emily, extended his hand. Ray Kowalski, I run a garage about 40 miles east of here. Emily shook his hand. Emily Carter. I know who you are, Ray said. It came out simply without fanfare, and then he turned back to Jack, and they began talking in low voices. And Emily stood there for a moment with the strange sensation of being known by people who had every reason to be strangers. She went back to work. It was all she knew how to do. By midnight, 3 more men had come in from the storm, all on bikes, all different patches, all directed to the counter by Jack, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime coordinating people in difficult conditions. Each of them introduced themselves to Emily. Each of them knew her name before she gave it. And each of them, in the first 5 minutes of sitting down, said something that made her grip the counter a little tighter. The first one, a man named Carver, who had the hands of someone who worked with them for a living, said he'd broken down on this stretch of highway 4 years ago. Transmission blown midwinter, no cell signal. A woman from the diner had driven him to the nearest town in her personal truck, refused gas money, told him to pay it forward. The second one, who went by priest, despite clearly not being one, said he'd stopped here once when he was riding cross country and had gone inside just for water, and the woman behind the counter had read something in his face. He didn't say what, and had sat down across from him in a booth and talked to him for 2 hours until he could breathe again. He didn't elaborate on what had been making it hard to breathe. He didn't need to. The third one set a photograph on the counter, slid it toward Emily without a word. It was a photo of a younger him, much younger, barely adolescent, sitting at a diner counter. The photograph was taken from behind, slightly blurry, the way photographs taken by strangers always are. On the counter in front of the boy was a plate of food and a glass of milk. Emily looked at the photograph for a long time. That's not my diner, she said carefully. No, the man said. His name was Cruz, she'd learn later. That's not your diner, but that boy is my son, and the woman who fed him that night and put him in a booth and called the county shelter so he had somewhere to sleep, that woman gave my son back to me. He looked at her. He told me about her for years. Blonde, tired blue eyes, wore an apron that said Silver Ridge on it. Emily went absolutely still. She saved his life, Cruz said, and his life saved mine. The photograph sat on the counter between them, and Emily looked at it and understood in a way that moved through her like electricity that the world she thought she'd been living in, a small, failing world, a world that was contracting toward a single ugly point, was actually much larger than she'd ever let herself see. She excused herself, went to the kitchen, stood at the sink with the water running cold over her wrists, a trick her mother had taught her for when the world got too big, too fast, and breathed. Just breathed. In and out. Until her hands stopped shaking. Danny was behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. You okay? He said. I don't know, she said honestly. Are you? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, but in a good way. Does that make sense? Yeah, she said. It does. She turned off the water, dried her hands, looked at him. He was leaning against the prep counter with his arms crossed, and his dark eyes were steady, and there was something different about his face from when she'd first seen him, something less held in, like a door had been left ajar. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. When you came in tonight, when Jack led you all in here, did any of you know this was the same diner? Danny shook his head. No, I recognized the highway. I remembered the general area, but it was dark and the storm was bad, and he paused. I didn't let myself look, because I wasn't sure I wanted to know if it was the same place or not. Sometimes the things that save you are safer as memories. Emily looked at him. And now, he met her eyes. Now I'm glad I looked. She nodded once. Then she picked up the coffee pot and went back out to the floor. It was 12:30 when Jack came to find her at the far end of the counter, away from the others, and set his phone on the counter between them, with the screen facing up. On it was a number. She looked at it without speaking. It was larger than the number she'd written on the napkin. That's what's been collected so far, Jack said. Tonight, in the last 3 hours. Emily looked up at him. That's not possible. I've got a network, he said. It moves fast when it needs to. Jack, that's more than, I know what it is. You can't just, Emily, his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of a voice that had learned through long experience. That volume was not the same thing as authority. Let me explain something to you. In my world, debts matter. They're the structure everything else is built on. You spent 11 years on this highway doing something that most people wouldn't do for their own family. You fed people who couldn't pay. You sat with people who couldn't talk. You called for help for people who didn't ask. He picked up his coffee. Every man who came through that door tonight, and every man I've called tonight, has a story that ends with your name in it somewhere, and not one of them forgot. So when I say this isn't charity, it's a debt, Emily said quietly. It's a debt, he confirmed. She looked at the number on the phone for a long moment. Then she said, the diner is not just money, Jack. The building needs work. The equipment is old. Even if the bank is paid off, I know, he said. You know, Ray, the man who came in earlier, he runs the garage. But his brother-in-law runs a construction company. And the guy next to Hector, the one with the sleeve tattoo, his name is Marco. He's an electrician, actually licensed. He almost smiled. We've got carpenters, plumbers, a guy who used to be an architect before he decided he'd rather ride. We've got people, Emily, and people who owe you aren't going to let this place fall apart. Emily looked around the diner, her diner, the cracked vinyl on the corner booth that she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. The light fixture over the register that hummed slightly when the temperature dropped. The kitchen that needed a new ventilation hood and a floor reseal, and approximately 40 other things she'd been cataloging in her mind for years, while the money to fix them failed to materialize. This is too much, she said. Tell that to Danny, Jack said. Tell that to Ghost. Tell that to Cruz. He leaned slightly forward on the counter. Tell me how much a life is worth, and then tell me this is too much. She couldn't. She knew she couldn't. So she didn't. At 1 a.m, the door opened again. And this time it wasn't a biker. It was a woman. 50s practical, coat, the kind of face that had spent a lot of time in weather. She came in and stopped just inside the door and looked around the room full of bikers and didn't flinch. Which told Emily something about her immediately, and then she looked at Emily behind the counter. Are you the owner? She said. I am. My name is Sandra Pruitt. I drive a delivery truck on this road. She came to the counter and sat down. I heard on the CB that there were people stranded at Silver Ridge. I've driven past this diner 100 times and never stopped. She paused. That's not entirely true. I stopped once, about 7 years ago. I was having the worst day of my life, and I pulled in here because I didn't trust myself to drive another 50 miles alone. Emily poured her coffee without being asked. Sandra wrapped her hands around the mug. The woman who worked here that night listened to me for an hour. Then she packed up a bag of food for me to take on the road and told me that the fact I'd pulled over instead of pushing through meant I was going to be okay. She looked at Emily. She was right. I'm glad, Emily said. Sandra hesitated. I heard from the CB chatter that this place might be closing. It might have been, Emily said. She glanced at Jack. Jack said nothing. He didn't need to. Sandra reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. Set it on the counter. It's not much. $400, it's what I have in my emergency cash. She pushed it across. I want you to have it. Emily looked at the envelope, looked at Sandra, felt something crack open in her chest in a way that was entirely out of proportion to $400, because it wasn't about the $400. It was about a woman who'd stopped her truck in a blizzard and driven through a Montana night with $400 in an envelope because a stranger had once been kind to her. I can't take your emergency money, Emily said. Please, Sandra said. It would mean a lot to me to be part of this. Emily took the envelope. The room had gotten quieter. She realized that the conversations around her had subsided and that most of the men in the diner had been watching this exchange, and the quality of the silence was not an awkward silence. It was a listening silence. The kind of silence that gathers around things that matter. Jack's phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did a barely perceptible shift. A kind of settling, like a man whose plan is coming together ahead of schedule. What? Emily said. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. The number had grown again, significantly. How? She said. Word travels, he said, especially in our world. A message goes out through the network, this woman, this place, this night, and it finds people who have a reason to listen. He set the phone down. It's going to keep going for a while. Emily looked at him. How long have you been doing this? I mean, is this something you do for people? He thought about it for a moment. No, he said, this isn't something I do. Then why? Because of Danny, he said. When Danny came to the club 2 years ago, he told me about a night on a Montana highway. He told me about a woman who fed him when he was down to his last option. He told me what that meant. He paused. I've been in this life a long time, Emily. I've seen a lot of things. And the thing that moves me, really moves me, is when someone does the right thing with no audience and no expectation of return. He looked at her steadily. That's rare. That's worth something. I was just feeding someone who was hungry, she said. No, he said. You were seeing someone who was invisible. There's a difference. He picked up his coffee. And apparently you've been doing it for 11 years, which means there's a lot of invisible people out there who are visible now. And some of them have phones, and some of them have money, and some of them are driving through a blizzard right now because someone finally told them where to go. At 1:45, two more trucks pulled in. People Emily didn't recognize, more people who somehow knew her name. A retired sheriff's deputy from Whitefish, who'd sheltered here during a flash flood. A couple from Billings whose car had broken down in front of her diner in the summer of 2010, and who she'd let sit in a back booth for 6 hours while they waited for the tow. A long-haul trucker who'd come in shaking with a fever 3 years back, and whom she'd dosed with aspirin and let sleep in the back booth for 4 hours and hadn't charged for anything. They came in one and two at a time, cold from the road, and each of them came to the counter first, and each of them said some version of the same thing, I remember you. And each of them left something on the counter, an envelope, a folded stack of bills, sometimes just coins, whatever they had. Emily stopped trying to give it back. Because Jack had been right about one thing, there was a dignity to the giving, and refusing it was a different kind of cruelty. By 2 a.m, the diner was full. Not the way it had been full in the old days, in the years before the interstate rerouting, when truckers and travelers kept every booth warm until sunrise. It was full in a different way. Fuller maybe, because every person in the room had a reason to be there that went beyond hunger or warmth or the simple need for coffee. Emily stood behind her counter and looked out at all of it, the faces, the steam from the mugs, the low, warm sound of people talking, and she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the shape of it. She felt like the diner was doing what it had always been for. Danny came out of this kitchen with a fresh pot and made the rounds without being asked, and Ghost told a story about a cross-country ride that had the 4 men in his booth laughing hard enough to disturb the table. And Sandra, the truck driver, had fallen into conversation with Hector that looked like it had been going on for years rather than 40 minutes. And Cruz had the photograph back out and was showing it to someone new. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Jack Lawson sat at the end of the counter and drank his coffee and watched and said very little. He caught Emily's eye across the room. You doing all right, he said. She thought about it honestly. Her feet hurt. She'd been on them for 16 hours. Her last supplies were gone. Completely gone, every egg and every slice of bread and every ounce of chili, and she would have to figure out in the morning how to restock with no credit in a frozen bank account. She had not slept. She was running on the same thin fuel as the coffee pot had been when the night started. Yes, she said, and meant it completely. He nodded, like that was the answer he'd been expecting. Then his phone buzzed again. He looked at it. And for the first time that night, something crossed his face that she might have described in another context as surprise. What is it? She said. He set the phone face down on the counter, looked at her, looked out the window at the dark and the snow and whatever was out there in it. And Emily, he said slowly, I need you to get more coffee ready. She looked at him. Jack, I told you, I'm out of... I know, he said, but I think you're going to need more than what you've got. He paused. I just got a message from a chapter in Idaho. They've been riding for 3 hours. He looked at her again. They want to know how far from the highway you are. Emily opened her mouth, closed it. That's not all, Jack said. There's a group from Wyoming, one from Colorado. He picked up his phone again, looked at it, set it back down. Emily, I think something is happening that's a little bigger than I planned for. The diner hummed around them. Outside, the storm was beginning, just barely, just at its edges to pull back. And somewhere out on those dark Montana roads in the cold and the snow, people were riding toward Silver Ridge, toward her. She gripped the counter, took one breath. Then she went to the phone on the wall, the old landline she kept meaning to disconnect, and she called her supplier's emergency line, and told them she needed everything they had on a same-day order and that she would explain later, and then she hung up and looked at Jack. How many, she said. He looked at his phone. The messages were still coming in. He shook his head slowly. I don't know yet. Guess. He looked at her, a long look, the look of a man choosing how much truth to give at once. More than this room, he said. Emily nodded. She went to the kitchen. She had work to do. The supplier's emergency line rang 6 times before anyone picked up. Emily stood at the wall phone in the kitchen with her shoulder pressed against the cold tile and listened to it ring, and told herself it was fine that someone would answer that. She hadn't just promised 20-plus people she could feed them when her pantry held exactly 1 can of crushed tomatoes, a half bag of rice, and the kind of hope that has no business calling itself a plan. Someone picked up on the 7th ring. This is Dave. Dave, it's Emily Carter, Silver Ridge Diner on Route 12. A pause. Miss Carter, it's 2:15 in the morning. I know what time it is, Dave. I need an emergency delivery. Everything you can load on a truck tonight. Egg, bacon, flour, coffee, industrial quantities. Bread if you have it. Potatoes. Whatever you've got that's ready to move. Another pause longer. Miss Carter, your account. I know about my account, she said. I'll pay on delivery. Cash. She said it before she had time to second-guess it because the folded stack of bills on the counter was real, and the number on Jack's phone screen had been real, and sometimes you had to bet on the thing that was right in front of you instead of the thing you were afraid of. Dave was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, thinking, calculating the risk of a 2 a.m. delivery against the cost of turning down a customer. Give me 45 minutes, he said. Thank you, Dave. She hung up, turned around. Danny was in the kitchen doorway again. He kept appearing there like a sentinel, which she was starting to find more comforting than unsettling. Supply run, he said, 45 minutes. You want me to start prepping what we have? Start with the rice. We'll do a big batch, stretch it with the tomatoes, some spice. It won't be the blue plate special, but it'll be hot. Hot is the only thing that matters right now, Danny said, and he was already moving. Emily went back out to the floor. The room had reorganized itself in the way rooms do when a group of people has been in them long enough. The original 20 had spread out and mixed with the newcomers, so that Sandra the truck driver was now sitting between 2 Hell's Angels, and Cruz had migrated to a booth with Ray Kowalski, and 2 men Emily hadn't met yet. And the retired deputy from Whitefish was at the counter telling Ghost a story that Ghost was listening to with his full attention, which was the kind of attention that made people feel like the only person in a room. Jack was still at the end of the counter. He had a notepad in front of him. Where it had come from, she didn't know, and he was writing in it in small, precise handwriting. He looked up when she came out. Supplies are coming, she said. He nodded. Good, because we're going to need them. How many more messages? He turned the notepad so she could see it. It was a list of chapter names and numbers. Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, South Dakota, next to each name a number. Emily read down the list. Her lips moved slightly. She stopped counting when she reached 200. Jack, she said, I know. This highway can't hold. They know back roads, he said simply. They'll manage. She looked at the list again. 200 and counting, converging on a roadside diner in a Montana blizzard because a phone call went out through a network that apparently had no respect for geography or weather or the laws of what was logistically possible. Why, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Jack set his pen down, looked at her with those pale gray eyes that had been reading her all night with a precision that should have felt invasive and somehow didn't. You want the real answer, he said, please. Because in our world, he said, people take. That's the story everyone tells about us, and I won't lie to you, sometimes it's not wrong. But the story no one tells is that we remember. We keep score, and when someone gives, really gives with nothing held back, no calculation, no angle that registers in a way that doesn't fade. He looked around the room. Every man I called tonight had a version of the same reaction. They said where and when, not why. They already knew why. Emily stood with that for a moment. Then Ghost looked up from the other end of the counter and said, he's being modest, by the way. His voice carried the particular authority of a man who has outlived most of his illusions and doesn't bother pretending otherwise. Jack put his name on this. In our world, when the president puts his name on something, it moves. Fast. Jack didn't respond to that. He picked up his pen and went back to his notepad. Ghost caught Emily's eye. and gave her a single slow nod that said, "This is real, and it is as large as you think it is, and you should let it be." She went back to work. At 2:40, Dave's truck pulled into the lot. Emily heard it before she saw it, the heavy diesel rumble, different from motorcycles, more deliberate. She went to the door and three of the bikers went with her without being asked, and before she could say anything, they were unloading crates from the truck, with the practiced efficiency of men who'd spent their lives moving heavy things in difficult conditions. Dave stood by the truck cab looking slightly stunned. "How many people are in there?" he said to Emily. "More than yesterday," she said. "Fewer than tomorrow." Dave blinked. "You need anything else? I've got another half truck at the depot." "Send it," she said. "All of it. I'll take everything." She paid him from the stack on the counter, counted it out right there in the cold, which Dave watched with the expression of a man revising his opinion of a situation rapidly, and then she went back inside and the crates followed her, and the kitchen became a different place, a fuller place, a place with options. Danny looked at the crates and looked at Emily and said, "Okay, now we can cook." "Now we cook," she agreed, and they did. The next 2 hours moved differently from the hours before. There was a rhythm to them and a heat and emotion rhythm, the kind that takes over when a kitchen is working right and everyone in it knows their job. Danny ran the grill. Emily ran the prep. Two of the bikers, one named Felix, who had worked a short order line in a previous life, and a younger one called Rook, who turned out to be genuinely skilled with a knife, came into the kitchen and fit themselves into the operation without disrupting it, taking direction from Emily, without ego, working clean, calling out when things were ready. Outside, the diner filled and filled again in waves as the new arrivals came off the road. At 3:10, a group of 12 came in from Idaho. At 3:30, 8 more from Wyoming. By 4 o'clock, there were people standing along the walls, which should have felt chaotic but didn't, because Jack had organized the room with the quiet efficiency he applied to everything, directing people to seats, managing the flow in and out, making sure the newcomers understood where they were and what kind of place it was, which was not a thing most men in his position would have thought to do. Emily noticed that. She noticed it the same way she noticed everything steadily, without making a production of it. At 4:15, something happened that she was not prepared for. She was coming out of the kitchen with a tray of plates when she heard a sound she hadn't heard in Silver Ridge Diner in 3 years. Not since the interstate rerouting, not since the slow, quiet erosion of her customer base had turned this place from loud to silent. Laughter, real laughter, the full body kind, spreading from table to table. She stopped in the middle of the floor with her tray and just listened to it. Ghost was telling a story. She caught it. Mid-current, something about a ride through New Mexico and a wrong turn and a very confused sheriff. And he told it with the timing of a man who had been telling stories for decades and knew exactly where the funny parts lived. The men around him were laughing hard enough that one of them had to set his coffee down. Sandra the trucker was laughing. The retired deputy was laughing. Even Ray Kowalski, who had the face of a man constitutionally opposed to levity, was smiling in the careful, reluctant way of someone discovering that smiling doesn't actually hurt. Emily stood in the middle of her diner, and listened to it laugh and felt something ease in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd stopped noticing the tightness. She distributed the plates, went back for more, kept moving. At 4:40, Cruz came to the counter and sat down and waited for a moment of quiet before he spoke. "There's something else," he said. Emily looked at him. "Tell me." "My son," he said, "the one in the photograph." He paused, seemed to be choosing words with care, the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. "He's been sober 3 years. He's got a job, a girl he's serious about. He's doing well." Another pause. "But he doesn't talk about the night he was alone on this highway. Not to me, not to anyone. It's been 7 years and he still won't touch it." "I understand that," Emily said. "I know you do, but here's the thing." Cruz set his hands flat on the counter. "When I called him tonight just to tell him where I was, just to check in, I mentioned where I was, this diner, this highway, and he went quiet." Cruz's voice changed slightly, not breaking, but bending under something. "And then he said, 'Tell her I made it.' Just that. Tell her I made it." Emily gripped the edge of the counter. "He's 26 years old," Cruz said. "He has a life." He looked at Emily, because of one night and one plate of food and one woman who saw him. There was a silence between them that was too full to fill with words, so Emily didn't try. She just held Cruz's gaze and let it sit between them until he nodded once and picked up his coffee. Jack had been watching from the end of the counter. He said nothing, but he wrote something in his notepad. By 5 in the morning, the storm had pulled back enough that the highway was visible again. Not clear, not safe for most people, but visible. And what was on it made Emily stop the first time she glanced out the window. Headlights, all of them stretching back further than she could see. Not moving fast, moving steadily, carefully in the manner of people who knew where they were going and were not in a hurry because they were sure they were going to get there. She went to the door, opened it. The cold hit her like a wall, but she stood in it and looked. The line of headlights was motorcycles. Dozens of them coming off the highway in a long ordered column, pulling into her lot in the shoulder of the road beyond it, shutting down their engines one by one, so that the sound went from a roar to a rumble, to a murmur, to a quiet that felt enormous. And in that quiet, she heard another sound. It took her a moment to identify it. Boots on asphalt, many boots, moving toward her. She stood in the doorway and the first group reached her, 10 men, frost on their jackets. Faces she'd never seen, eyes that looked at her with a directness that was not threatening, but was overwhelming in its own way. The way being seen completely by a stranger is always a little overwhelming. And the one in front of the group looked at her and said, "Are you Emily Carter?" "I am," she said. "We rode 4 hours," he said, not complaining, stating a fact. "We heard you needed help." She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." They filed past her, 10, then 20, then more behind them, and she stood at the door and watched them come, and her hand on the door frame was steady, which surprised her because the rest of her was not entirely steady. The rest of her was doing something complicated that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite laughing and didn't have a clean English word for it. Danny appeared at her elbow. He looked out at the motorcycles, at the people, at the long line of headlights still visible on the highway. "Emily," he said quietly. "Yeah, there are a lot of people. Yeah. Do we have enough food?" She thought about Dave's truck and the crates in the kitchen and Felix on the grill and Rook with his knife and the rice that was already done and the bacon that was already going and the eggs by the flat. "We will," she said. She went back to work. At 5:45, with the diner beyond capacity and people crowding the doorway and the lot outside full of motorcycles and the road beyond that lined with more, Jack came to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway, the same doorway Danny kept appearing in, and he waited until Emily looked up. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She turned. His voice had a different weight to it, not the steady, measured weight it had carried all night. Something more deliberate, like a man who has been waiting to say something and has decided the time is now. "We talked," he said. "The chapter presidents who are here, the ones on the phone, all of us." "About what?" "About this place." He gestured not broadly, just a slight tilt of his head that encompassed everything. The diner, the road, the people, the whole improbable night. "About what it is, what it's been." Emily set down what she was holding. "Jack, let me finish." He came into the kitchen, stood across the prep counter from her. "In our world, there are places that matter. Places that have meaning beyond what they are on paper. Places where the road can take you when everything else falls apart." He looked at her steadily. "This is one of those places. It has been for 11 years. We just didn't know it until tonight." "What are you saying?" she said. He reached into his jacket and brought out an envelope, set it on the prep counter. "Open it." She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She read it again. Her eyes tracked the words with the particular careful slowness of someone who needs to make sure they're reading what they think they're reading. It was a declaration, formal, written, signed by 14 names she didn't recognize, except for one, Jack Lawson at the bottom, his signature large and unhesitating. The declaration stated that Silver Ridge Diner, operated by Emily Carter on Route 12 in Silver Ridge, Montana, was hereby recognized as a protected waypoint. The language used was specific and clearly not improvised under the collective agreement of the signatory chapters. It stated that the diner would receive guaranteed patronage from all affiliated members traveling the Northern Quarter. It stated that repair and renovation support would be provided. It stated that no affiliated member would permit harm to come to the establishment or its operator. The last line read, "This place saves some of us. We intend to return the favor indefinitely." Emily set the paper down on the prep counter, pressed both hands flat on it, looked at Jack. 14 chapters, she said. There are 3 more who haven't signed yet because they're still writing, he said. They'll sign when they get here. She looked at the paper again. This is Jack. Do you understand what you're committing to? 14 chapters, that's... I know what it is, he said. We know what we're doing. He paused. The question is whether you'll accept it. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that Danny, who had been pretending not to listen from the far end of the kitchen, stopped pretending and looked too. There's a condition, Jack said. A condition. You keep running it the same way you've been running it. His voice was completely serious. The same way. You feed people who can't pay. You sit with people who need sitting with. You stay open when staying open doesn't make financial sense. You don't change what this place is because it's more secure now. He held her gaze. That's the condition. The diner doesn't become something different just because the money is better. Emily looked at him and thought about what it had felt like to stand in this kitchen at 6 o'clock tonight, alone with $52 and a failing coffee pot in 7 days. She thought about Cruz's son, 26 years old, with a life and a girl he was serious about, who had told his father, "Tell her I made it." She thought about Danny, who had walked into a kitchen and picked up a spatula and worked beside her all night like they had always known each other. She thought about Ghost and his ring on his right hand, and 13 years of carrying a random act of kindness like something sacred because that was what it had been. She picked up the pen from the prep counter. "Where do I sign?" she said. Jack almost smiled. It was close enough. He turned the paper over, and there at the bottom was a blank line with her name printed beneath it, and she signed it in her regular handwriting, not large, not dramatic, just her name, the same name she'd been signing on supply orders and bank statements and foreclosure notices for 11 years. She put the pen down. "Good," Jack said. He folded the paper with care, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in his jacket. Then he looked around the kitchen at Danny, at Felix, at Rook, at the stacked crates of supplies and the running grill, and the evidence of a night's worth of feedings coupled with whatever was available. "Ray's brother-in-law," he said, "the contractor. He wants to come by next week with some people and take a look at what needs doing." "Okay," Emily said. "Marco, the electrician, says that light fixture over the register is a fire hazard." "I know," she said. "It's been doing that for 2 years. It won't be doing it much longer." He paused. "The booth in the corner with the cracked vinyl. I've been meaning to fix that." "Someone will fix it," he said, "all of it." He turned to go, then stopped. Turned back. "One more thing." "What?" He reached into his jacket again, pulled out a different envelope, thicker, heavier, set it on the counter. "Total collection as of 5 minutes ago," he said. She looked at the envelope, didn't open it. "How much?" she said. "Enough," he said. "More than enough." She picked it up, felt the weight of it, set it back down. "I don't know how to do this," she said, and for the first time all night, her voice cracked. "Just once, just briefly, just enough to be honest. I don't know how to be the person that this many people want to help. I know how to be the person doing the helping. I don't know how to be on this side of it." Jack looked at her. "Yes, you do," he said. "You've been practicing all night." He paused. "You let Danny help in the kitchen. You took Sandra's $400. You opened the door when every instinct told you not to." He tilted his head slightly. "You already know how. You're just not used to it yet." She picked up her spatula, looked at the grill, looked at the kitchen full of people who had shown up in the middle of the night to stand beside her. "Okay," she said, and went back to cooking. Outside, the line of motorcycles on the highway was still growing. Inside Silver Ridge Diner, the coffee was hot and the grill was going, and the room was loud in the best possible way, the way it had been before in the years she was starting to let herself think of as before rather than as lost. And at the far end of the counter in the first booth by the window, Cruz sat with his phone in his hand and typed a message to his son. "Found the place. Found her. She's exactly what you said." The message was sent at 5:58 in the morning. The reply came back in under a minute. "Tell her the soup was good that night. Even if it wasn't." Cruz read it twice. Then he laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised and full of something that had been locked up for a long time, and set his phone face down on the table and picked up his coffee. The sun was coming, not here yet, but coming. Emily could feel it, the way you feel things that are still an hour away, but already inevitable. The storm had broken, and the road was clearing, and the night was ending, and something else, something she didn't have a word for yet, something that felt architectural and permanent, was just beginning. She cooked. The grill ran, the coffee poured, the door kept opening. The sun came up at 7:12. Emily knew the exact time because she'd been watching for it, the way she'd been watching the clock all night, not impatiently, just aware. Aware that something was shifting, that the dark was losing its grip on things. She was at the grill when the light changed, and she felt it before she saw it. A warmth on the back of her neck through the kitchen window, faint and tentative, like something testing whether it was welcome. She flipped a row of bacon without looking up, kept moving. Danny was beside her. He'd been there most of the night, and somewhere in the last 4 hours the arrangement had stopped feeling like a stranger helping out and started feeling like something that had always been the case. He worked without being told, anticipated what she needed before she asked for it, moved around her in the kitchen with the particular awareness of someone who had learned to share a small space with a person they respected. "You should sit down," he said. "I'll sit down when there's no one left to feed," she said. "There are still 40 people out there. Then I'll sit down later." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to his eggs without arguing, which was the correct decision. Felix had gone to catch 2 hours of sleep in one of the booths, and Rook had taken over the dish station, and the kitchen had found its rhythm again after the surge of the 5 o'clock arrivals. And Emily moved through it with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for 11 years and knew every inch of her domain the way she knew her own hands. Except her kitchen wasn't quite her kitchen anymore. The crates from Dave's delivery had changed its geography slightly. There were more people in it. There was more noise, more warmth, more of the particular energy that fills a space when a lot of people are doing something with genuine purpose. It should have felt like an intrusion. It didn't. It felt like the kitchen becoming what it had always had the capacity to be, if only there had been enough reason. At 7:30, Jack came to the kitchen doorway. "Can you take a break?" he said, "in a few minutes." "Now would be better," he said. "There's something you need to see." She handed her spatula to Danny without looking, wiped her hands on her apron, followed Jack out through the diner, past the booths, past the counter, where Ghost was still holding court, past the door and outside. The cold hit her. She hadn't been outside since she'd stood in the doorway at 5 in the morning watching the motorcycles come off the highway. The air was sharp and clean, the way Montana air gets after a hard storm, like the weather had scoured everything and left it new. She looked at the parking lot. She looked at the road. She stood very still. The motorcycles lined both shoulders of the highway as far as she could see in either direction. Not dozens, not 50. She stopped trying to count at 150, and she wasn't close to the end of the line. They were parked with military precision, nose out in rows so straight they might have been measured. Some of the riders were still on them. Most were standing in groups talking, moving slowly back toward the diner in shifts. The exhaust from the engines had already stopped. They'd shut down in sequence sometime in the last hour, and the silence they left behind was enormous and somehow more impressive than the sound had been. Jack stood beside her. He didn't say anything. "How many?" she said. "As of 20 minutes ago, 287. He paused. "3 more groups are still on the road. I expect we'll clear 300 before 8 o'clock. Emily looked at the highway and the motorcycles and the people and felt something move through her that she couldn't have named, precisely not shock, because shock had burned itself out somewhere around 3 in the morning. Something deeper than shock. Something that had to do with the particular vertigo of realizing that the life you thought you were living and the life you were actually living were not the same life. 300 people, she said, give or take. 300 people rode through a Montana blizzard. The storm had mostly cleared by midnight for the southern groups, he said. The Idaho and Wyoming chapters caught it bad. The Colorado group took the eastern route around most of it. He looked at her. Nobody turned back. She exhaled. Jack, I know. I don't have words for this. You don't need them, he said. Just look at it. She looked at it for a long time. The highway lined with machines and people and the particular quiet of a lot of living that had been done to get here. Then she turned back toward the diner. I need to make more coffee, she said. He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him all night. Yeah, he said, you do. Ray Kowalski was waiting just inside the door. He had his jacket off and was holding a folded piece of paper that he unfolded as soon as Emily came in, spreading it on the nearest table. She looked at it. It was a rough sketch, dimensions noted in pencil rooms, labeled structural elements marked in a different color. My brother-in-law did this on his phone on the ride over, Ray said. Texted it to me at 4 this morning. The man doesn't sleep when he's got a project. He tapped the paper. This is the diner as it is. These are his preliminary thoughts on what it could be. Emily leaned over the sketch. The current footprint of Silver Ridge Diner was represented accurately. She recognized the counter, the kitchen placement, the booth arrangement. But the pencil lines extended beyond the current walls. A larger kitchen, a second dining room, a covered area on the side that the sketch labeled gathering space with a question mark after it. That's expansion, she said. That's what it could be, Ray said. Nothing's decided, but Gary, my brother-in-law, he wants to come out next week with his crew and start with what needs fixing first. The roof on the east side is losing heat. The electrical panel Marco says is 30 years old if it's a day. The parking lot needs gravel. He tapped each item as he named it. We start there. We work out from there. Ray, she said, this is complicated, he offered. I was going to say overwhelming. He looked at her steadily. He had the manner of a man who dealt in tangible things, engines, structures, things that could be measured and repaired, and applied that same practicality to emotional situations, which was its own kind of intelligence. You've been dealing with overwhelming all night, he said. You haven't slowed down once. Don't start now. She looked at the sketch again, the expanded kitchen, the gathering space with its question mark. He drew this from memory. He's driven this highway for 20 years, Ray said. He knows this building. He paused. A lot of people know this building, Emily. They just never said so. She folded the sketch carefully, set it on the counter. It sat there like a promise that had been given a physical form. At 8 o'clock, Marco the electrician appeared at the counter with a cup of coffee and a look on his face that suggested he'd been up for 30 hours and had made his peace with it. He was shorter than most of the men who'd come through the door that night, compact and precise in his movements, with the focused eyes of someone who spent his professional life looking for things other people missed. The fixture over the register, he said without preamble. I know, Emily said. It's not just an annoyance, he said. The wiring behind it is compromised. I had a look while you were outside with Jack. He set his coffee down. You've been running on luck with that panel for a while. I won't lecture you. You had other things to worry about, but I want to come back Tuesday with my tools and fix it properly. Not a patch, a proper fix. Emily looked at him. How much? Don't, he said flatly, not unkindly, but with finality. Just be here Tuesday. She held his gaze for a moment. I'll be here, she said. He picked up his coffee and went back to his booth. Simple as that. Ghost had been listening from 3 stools down. He turned his mug in his hands and said, You're going to have to get used to people helping you. I'm working on it, she said. Work faster, he said, because there's more coming and you keep looking like you're about to apologize for it. She laughed, short and real. Is that what I'm doing? That's what you're doing, he said. Stop it. Take the help. Say thank you. Move forward. He looked at her with those steady eyes that had seen enough of the world to have earned the right to be direct. You spent 11 years giving. The receiving is allowed to take a minute to feel right. But let it feel right. Emily stood with them, let it settle. Then she said, You were a different kind of man when you came through here 13 years ago. Yes, Ghost said, I was. What changed? I was quiet for a moment. I found out that the grief didn't have to be the end of the story, he said. It could be the middle. It could be the part that made everything after it mean more. He set his coffee down. That's what that night gave me. Not hope exactly, just possibility. The idea that there was more road ahead. He paused. I've been riding ever since. She thought about her own 7-day window. Her $52.37. The foreclosure notice on the inside of the office door. She thought about how it had felt to believe, genuinely believe, that the road ahead had run out. I thought I was at the end, she said. Last night, before you all came in, I thought this was it. I know, Ghost said. That's what the middle feels like. At 8:45, a car pulled into the lot that didn't belong to any of the bikers. Emily noticed it because it was the kind of car she recognized, a county vehicle, sensible and slightly battered, the kind of car that county officials drove when they were doing something official. She straightened behind the counter and watched the door. The man who came in was in his 50s, wearing the kind of vest that meant he was from the county assessor's office, or possibly the zoning department. Emily had dealt with enough local government in 11 years to read the outerwear codes. He stopped just inside the door and looked around at the diner full of Hell's Angels with an expression that went through several rapid phases: surprise, alarm, recalibration, before settling on cautious professional neutrality. He mowed his way to the counter, sat down. Emily poured him coffee before he could ask. "Miss Carter," he said, "that's me. My name is Gerald Ham. I'm with the County Development Office." He wrapped both hands around the mug like he needed something to hold on to. "I heard on the radio that there was an event at Silver Ridge Diner. I wasn't sure what to expect." "Neither was I," Emily said honestly. Gerald looked around the room again. Are these all guests?" Emily said. "Right." He looked back at her. "I drove out because I know the situation with your establishment. Miss Carter and I wanted to." He stopped. Started again. "I used to eat here years ago when I was working the northern route for the assessor's office. I used to stop in." He turned his mug on the counter. "You once let me sit here for 3 hours during a storm. Didn't charge me anything, just kept the coffee coming." Emily looked at him. "I always felt bad about that," he said. "That I never came back, never." He shook his head. "When I heard you were in foreclosure proceedings, I looked at your file. There are some options there, Miss Carter, that we haven't fully explored. Hardship provisions, historic property designations, potentially given the age of the building." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a card. Set it on the counter. "I'd like to sit down with you this week and go through them. Properly. No cost." Emily looked at the card, looked at Gerald Ham, who was doing his level best to maintain a professional demeanor in a diner full of Hell's Angels at 8:45 in the morning. She felt a sudden, powerful, slightly hysterical urge to laugh that she suppressed with effort. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. I should have done it sooner," he said. He picked up his coffee. "The chili is still the best in the county, by the way. I still think about it." "I'll make you a fresh batch on Tuesday," she said. He almost smiled. "I'll be here." At 9:15, Danny came out of the kitchen and found Emily at the counter making a fresh pot and stood across from her and said, "I need to tell you something." She looked up. "When the storm is fully clear," he said, "Jack is going to need to move the group. They can't stay indefinitely. There are things to get back to responsibilities." He paused. "But I want you to know I asked Jack if I could stay for a few days to help with the transition." He said yes. Emily set the coffee pot down. "Danny, I'm a decent cook," he said. "I know how a kitchen works, and you're going to have a lot more traffic in the next few days than you're used to handling alone." He met her eyes. "Let me help. Not because I owe you, because I want to." She looked at him for a long moment. This young man who had walked into her kitchen at 8:30 the previous night and as a stranger, and had spent the last 9 hours working beside her like someone who had always been there. "You have a place to be," she said. "People expecting you." "Nothing that can't wait a few days," he said. She nodded slowly. "There's a back room," she said. "I use it for storage, but there's a cot in there. It's not much." "It's more than I had 3 years ago," he said. She picked up the coffee pot. "Thank you," she said. It came out simply without the reflexive apology that Ghost had correctly identified as her default. "Just thank you, clean and direct." Danny nodded, went back to the kitchen. The next thing that happened, Emily was not prepared for. At 9:40, Jack came back to the counter. He sat down in his usual stool. It had become his stool over the course of the night, in the way that certain seats become certain people's. And he set his phone on the counter and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Measured, careful, like a man about to cross a threshold he wants to be sure about. "There's something else," he said. She had heard that phrase enough times in the last 12 hours that her nervous system had started to brace for it automatically. "Tell me." "The chapter presidents talked again this morning while you were in the kitchen." He paused. "There's a name for what this place is going to be." He looked at her steadily. "If you want it." She waited. "Angel's Haven," he said. The diner was loud around them. Conversation, the clink of mugs, someone near the door telling a story with their hands. But the counter where they sat felt very quiet. "Angel's Haven," she repeated. "It means something in our world," he said. "A haven is a place that's protected, a place where the road can take you and you're safe. It means something formal." It goes into the network. It gets communicated. It's not a thing we do lightly. He held her gaze. But you should know it also means something in the other direction. It means this place carries a standard. People will come here because of what it's known to be. And what it's known to be, what we're declaring it to be, is exactly what it's always been. Emily looked at the diner around her, the counter she'd wiped down 10,000 times, the booths where she'd sat with people who were falling apart and tried to hold them together long enough to remember they were whole, the kitchen where she'd stretched her last supplies into meals for strangers more times than she could count. Angel's Haven. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. The name, she said. Is it because of the club? Because of... No, he said, and there was something in his voice that was entirely serious. It's not about us. It's because this place is what the word means. He paused. A haven made by someone who never asked for anything in return. He looked at her. The angel in the name is you, Emily, whether you like it or not. She looked down at the counter for a moment. Then she looked up. I like it, she said quietly. Jack nodded. He picked up his pen and wrote something in his notepad, the last entry she would later learn, because what he was writing was the date and the name official, committed to record, in the particular way that Jack Lawson committed things to record, which was the way that meant they were done and final and would not be revisited. At 10:15, the first group began to leave. It wasn't an exodus, it was more like a tide going out slow and gradual and inevitable. A group of 8 from the Colorado chapter came to the counter. First, one by one, each of them shaking Emily's hand, or in 2 cases pulling her into a brief, careful hug that she accepted without stiffening, which was progress. They left bills on the counter that she stopped arguing about. They went out to their bikes, and she could hear the engines starting up one by one, a sequence of sounds that should have been a diminishment but wasn't, because there was something ceremonial about it, something that felt like an acknowledgement rather than a departure. Ghost was the second to last of the original 20 to leave. He sat at the counter until 10:40 and finished his coffee, and then he stood up and put on his jacket, and he looked at Emily for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, 13 years is a long time to carry something. You wore it well, she said. He reached out and put his hand briefly over hers where it rested on the counter. Not a handshake, just that, just the weight of it. Take care of this place, he said. I will, she said. He went out. The door closed. Through the window, she watched him walk to his bike, put on his helmet, start the engine. He didn't look back. Some people don't, and it means nothing except that they trust the thing they're leaving behind. Cruz left at 11. He stopped at the door and turned back and looked at Emily across the room full of people. I'm going to call my son, he said, when I get to a signal. Tell him the soup really was good that night, she said. I mean it. He smiled a full smile, the kind that rearranged his whole face, and went out. Jack was last. He came to the counter at 11:30 with his jacket fully on and his gloves in his hand and the notepad in his breast pocket. He sat down one final time on his stool and looked at Emily and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they want to remember accurately. You need anything? He said. You call. I don't have your number. He took the pen from his pocket, picked up a napkin from the dispenser, wrote on it, set it on the counter. That's mine, he said, and Ray's and Marco's. He paused. Danny's staying. He'll have the others. I know, she said. The contractor is coming Tuesday. The electrician is coming Tuesday. Gerald Ham from the county. Also Tuesday, she said. He almost smiled. You're going to be busy. I'm used to busy, she said. He stood, picked up his gloves. Then he reached into his jacket and set one more thing on the counter. It was the envelope, the heavy one, the one he'd brought to the kitchen. She hadn't opened it since he'd shown it to her. Open it now, he said. She picked it up, opened it, counted it with the practiced speed of a woman who had handled cash for 11 years. $87,400. She looked up. The extra is for supplies, he said, for the next few months, and for whatever Gerald can't fix through the county. He held her gaze. It's done, Emily. The debt is gone. The diner is yours. She gripped the envelope and the money inside it and looked at this man who had come through her door at 8:30 the previous night as a stranger with ice in his beard and pale eyes and a name that meant death. And she understood something clearly that she hadn't let herself understand until this moment, that the world was not the diminishing, contracting thing she had believed it to be in those dark hours before the engines sounded through the snow. It was large. It was connected in ways that ran deeper than roads or maps. And the things you sent out into it, the meals, the coffee, the hours of sitting with people, the simple acts of seeing someone when they needed to be seen, they didn't disappear. They traveled. They found people and changed them and lived inside those people for years. And then one night in a blizzard in Montana, they came back. All of them at once, 300 strong. Thank you, she said, the same words she'd been saying all night, but different now. Fuller, like they'd finally found the right size for what they needed to carry. Jack put on his gloves. Thank you, he said, for opening the door. He went out. She heard his engine start, heard it join the others, the ones still warming up the ones already on the road. A sound that built and then began gradually to diminish as the line of motorcycles pulled onto the highway and moved south and north and east and west, dispersing back into the country they'd come from. Danny came out of the kitchen and stood beside Emily at the window. They watched the last of the motorcycles disappear down the highway. How are you doing? He said. She thought about it honestly. Her feet hurt badly. She had been awake for 27 hours. Her kitchen was lower on supplies than it had been before Dave's delivery because she'd fed 300 people through the night. The envelope in her hand held more money than she'd seen in one place since she'd bought the diner 11 years ago. The napkin with Jack's number on it was tucked in her apron pocket. I'm okay, she said. And then because she was being honest, I'm better than okay. Danny nodded. What do you need? She looked at the diner. The booths needed wiping. The counter needed a full clean. The kitchen would take an hour at least. The coffee pot was running low. There were things to do, the same things there had always been, the work that a diner required every single day, regardless of what else was happening, regardless of miracles or blizzards or 300 motorcycles on a Montana highway. The work was the same. The place was different. Or maybe the place was the same and she was different. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the only thing that had changed was the size of what she could see. Start another pot, she said. We've still got people to feed. Danny went back to the kitchen. Emily picked up her rag, began wiping down the counter from one end to the other, the same motion she had made 10,000 times before, the same motion she would make 10,000 times again. Outside, the last engine sound faded. The highway was quiet, the morning was bright and cold and clean, and Silver Ridge Diner Angel's Haven stood in the middle of it, lights on sign glowing open. The way it had always been, the way it would always be. 6 months later, Danny still made the coffee first thing every morning. It was a small thing. Emily had never asked him to do it. He'd simply started doing it on his second day when she came out of the back room at 5:45 and found the pot already running and a mug set out on the counter in exactly the spot where she always stood. She hadn't said anything about it. Neither had he. It had just become the way mornings worked at Angel's Haven, the same way 100 other small things had become the way things worked without anyone deciding they would. She came out that Tuesday morning in late July, 6 months, and 12 days after the night, everything changed and the coffee was ready, and Danny was already at the grill, and the first table of the morning rush was already filled with 3 bikers she recognized from the Idaho chapter, who came through on the northern run every 3 weeks with the reliability of a scheduled service, and always ordered the same thing and always left the same tip, which was generous to the point of being slightly embarrassing, which she had stopped arguing about in month 2. Morning, she said to the room in general. Morning, Miss Emily, said the one called Shepherd, who was the youngest of the Idaho 3, and who had appointed himself a kind of informal goodwill ambassador between the Haven and the northern chapters, a role he took seriously and executed with considerable enthusiasm. She poured her coffee, stood at the counter, looked around. The diner looked different from the outside now. Ray's brother-in-law, Gary, had seen to that in the first 3 weeks, arriving on that Tuesday as promised, with a crew of 7 and working with a focused intensity that Emily had found both impressive and slightly alarming, as though the building itself was surprised to be paid this much attention. The roof was solid, the parking lot was gravel smooth and properly lined. The sign out front was new, same words, same colors, just brighter, more legible from the highway. The kind of sign that said, this place is here and it intends to stay. Marco had fixed the electrical panel in one long Tuesday that stretched into Wednesday morning, during which he drank 6 cups of coffee and spoke very little except to occasionally say something technical to himself under his breath. When he was done, the light above the register had stopped humming. Every outlet worked. The kitchen ran clean power for the first time in years. Marco had presented Emily with a handwritten bill for parts only, no labor, which she had tried to argue with and failed. Gerald Hamnet had come on the same Tuesday as promised, and the meeting that Emily had expected to take an hour had taken 4, because Gerald was thorough and because the hardship provisions and the historic property considerations had opened into a more complex conversation about route designation and landmark status that Gerald navigated with a precision that made her revise her opinion of county officials significantly upward. By the time he left, the immediate foreclosure threat had been restructured into a payment plan that the new cash reserves handled easily, and Gerald had also quietly flagged Angel's Haven for consideration in a state small business recovery program that Emily hadn't known existed. He came in for chili every other Friday now. He always called ahead. The booth with the cracked vinyl had been reupholstered. The kitchen had a new ventilation hood and a sealed floor, and a second prep station that Danny had built himself over a weekend in February using lumber. Ray had dropped off an instructions he found online, which Emily had watched with the specific anxiety of someone observing competence they hadn't expected, and found she didn't need to intervene in. The gathering space from Gary's sketch, the covered side area, with its original question mark, had become real in April, a sheltered outdoor area with long wooden tables, where on good weather days, riders could eat outside and the line that formed at peak hours could breathe. There was always a line now, not the desperate, anxious kind she used to pray for in the years after the rerouting, a different kind, the kind that meant something was worth waiting for. At 7:15, the door opened and a woman came in that Emily didn't recognize. 30s, road-worn, the particular posture of someone who'd been driving a long time and was trying not to show how tired they were. She stopped just inside the door and looked around and then made her way to the counter and sat down on the second stool. "Can I get coffee?" she said. "Already coming," Emily said. She'd had the cup out before the woman finished the sentence. 11 years of reading people from across a counter. Some things didn't change. The woman wrapped her hands around the mug, didn't say anything for a moment. Emily recognized the silence. It was the silence of someone carrying something that needed to settle before it could be put down. She let it settle, went to check on the Idaho 3, came back, refilled the mug without being asked. "How far are you driving?" she said. "Bozeman," the woman said. "Eventually." "Long drive from where?" "Chicago." The woman looked up. "I've been on the road 5 days. I just needed—" She stopped. "I saw the sign. I just needed to stop somewhere that felt—" She looked around the diner again. The warm light, the booths, the bikers who, being bikers, were not particularly quiet, but were this morning, as every morning, conducting themselves with a consideration that tended to surprise people who expected something else. "Real," she said finally. "I needed somewhere that felt real." Emily looked at her steadily. "You want something to eat?" "I can't really, The woman started reaching for her wallet. "Don't worry about it," Emily said. "Tell me what you like, and I'll tell Danny what to make." The woman looked at her. Something in her face wavered, not breaking, just bending the way things bend before they find a new shape. "I'm not a charity case," she said, and there was an edge in it that was really just dignity, which Emily had always understood to be the same thing. "I know you're not," Emily said, "but I have a rule about people driving alone from Chicago. The first cup of coffee is free, and so is whatever they eat with it. It's not charity, it's policy." The woman looked at her for another moment. Then she exhaled slowly and said, "Eggs, scrambled, and toast if that's not too much." "It's not too much," Emily said. She leaned toward the kitchen pass-through. "Danny, scrambled eggs and toast, please." "On it," Danny called back. Emily turned back to the woman, who was looking at the room again, at the photographs on the wall, which were different from the photographs that had always been there because in March, a box had arrived from an address in Colorado with no note inside, just photographs. Dozens of them. Photographs of people in this diner going back years, some clearly taken by customers, some taken without the subject, knowing all of them, capturing moments of the particular ordinary intimacy that happens between a place and the people who need it. There was one of Ghost, much younger, sitting at the counter with his ring on his right hand and his coffee mug and a look on his face that was the face of a man finding his way back to himself. There was one of Danny. She hadn't recognized him at first. It was such a different Danny, hollow-cheeked and far away, sitting in the back booth with a plate of food in front of him and his hands in his lap and his eyes down. And there was one she couldn't account for at all that she'd found in the middle of the box and held for a long time, a photograph of herself behind the counter, pouring coffee, not looking at the camera, looking at whoever she was pouring for. She didn't know who had taken it or when, but she'd framed it and put it on the wall with the rest of them because it showed her something she hadn't been able to see from her own side of the counter, what it looked like to be cared for by someone who was paying attention. She'd cried for about 10 minutes over that photograph. Then she'd gone back to work. The woman from Chicago was looking at it, the one of Emily. "Is that you?" she said. "That's me," Emily said. "Who took it?" "I don't know," Emily said honestly. "Someone who was here." She paused. "People pass through here. Sometimes they leave things." "What kind of things?" "Notes sometimes," Emily said. "Letters. One time someone left a book with a page marked and a sentence underlined that I read every single day since." She paused. "Money sometimes. I have a fund now. I use it to feed people who can't pay. Some weeks it runs low, and a week later, there's an envelope on the counter, and it's full again. I've stopped being surprised by it." The woman from Chicago was quiet. Then she said, "What's this place called?" "Angel's Haven," Emily said. The woman absorbed that. "Is there a story behind it?" Emily picked up the coffee pot, looked around the diner at Danny behind the pass-through at the Idaho 3, finishing their breakfast at the booth in the corner where a young couple had come in 20 minutes ago and ordered the minimum and sat very close together in the particular way of people who were in some kind of trouble and had temporarily run out of options, which Emily had seen and had told Danny about quietly, and which he had addressed by sending over 2 plates they hadn't ordered and a discreet nod that meant it was handled. "There's a story," Emily said. "I'll tell you sometime when I have a few hours." The woman almost smiled. "That long?" "It's a long story," Emily said, "but it has a good ending." Danny put the eggs up at the pass-through. Emily took the plate and set it in front of the woman from Chicago without ceremony, because that was how it was done, without ceremony, without performance, just the act itself, clean and direct. The woman picked up her fork, ate, and in the particular silence of someone eating their first real meal in too long, Emily saw her shoulders drop by about an inch, which was all it took sometimes. Just the shoulders, just that 1 inch of tension released by warmth and food in a place that didn't ask anything of you. At 9 o'clock, Emily's phone rang. She looked at the screen, a Montana number she knew by heart now. "Morning, Jack," she said. "Morning." His voice was the same on the phone as in person level, unhurried, carrying its own authority without trying. "How's business?" "Good. 3 from the Idaho chapter came through this morning. I've got a woman from Chicago who drove 5 days and needed a stop." She paused. "The usual." "The usual," he said, and she could hear the faint approval in it. "I'm calling because there's a group coming through Thursday from the Dakota chapter. 8 of them. I wanted you to have notice." "I appreciate it. How's Danny?" She glanced toward the kitchen. Through the pass-through, she could see the back of Danny's head, his easy movements at the grill, the particular competence that had turned out to be one of the best things that had happened to her kitchen in 11 years. "He's good," she said. "He's really good. He told me last week he's thinking about staying longer," Jack said. "He told me too," she said. "I told him the cot was his as long as he wanted it." A pause on the line. Then Jack said, "You know he's good with people, not just the cooking, the way he talks to people who come in alone." "I know," Emily said. "I've been watching him." "He learned from somebody," Jack said. She didn't answer that. There wasn't a lot to say to it that wouldn't sound like false modesty or its opposite, both of which she had been working to avoid. "Thursday," she said. 8 from Dakota. I'll be ready." "You always are," he said, and hung up. She put the phone in her apron pocket and went back to the floor. The woman from Chicago had finished her eggs and was on her 3rd cup of coffee, which Emily had refilled twice without comment. She looked better, not fixed. Nothing was ever that simple, but steadier, more present inside her own face. "Can I ask you something?" the woman said. "Sure." "This place the way it is, did you plan it? Did you always want it to be this kind of place?" Emily thought about it. The real answer, not the tidy version. "I just didn't want to send anyone away," she said finally. "From the beginning, I just always thought if someone comes through that door, they came through for a reason, and the least I can do is make sure they leave in better shape than they arrived." She set the coffee pot down. The rest of it kind of built up around that one thing. The woman looked at her. "That's a really simple philosophy." "Simple things are hard," Emily said. "That's why they mean something." The woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her jacket and put something on the counter. It was a $20 bill folded twice. For the eggs, she said, and whatever's left for whoever needs it. Emily looked at the 20, looked at the woman. I told you. I know what you told me, the woman said. This isn't payment, it's participation. She held Emily's gaze. There's a difference. Emily picked up the 20, put it in the box under the counter, the fun box, the one that ran low and refilled itself in ways she'd stopped trying to track. Thank you, she said. The woman stood, put on her jacket, looked around the diner one more time in the way people look at places they're going to carry with them. I'm going to tell people about this place, she said. People find it, Emily said. They always do. The woman went out. Through the window, Emily watched her get into her car and sit for a moment before she started it. Just sat, one breath, then the engine, and she pulled out of the lot and onto the highway and headed west toward Bozeman and whatever she was going toward and away from. At the same time, the way everyone was always going toward and away from things simultaneously on every road in the country. At 11:30, the lunch rush began building, which was a thing Emily still hadn't fully adapted to psychologically, the idea of a lunch rush, after 3 years of quiet that had felt permanent. It came in waves now, the way it used to in the old days before the rerouting, bikers on the Northern Quarter, truckers who'd been told by other truckers, locals who'd driven out from town because word had reached them, travelers who'd seen the new sign from the highway or read about Angel's Haven in one of the 3 travel blogs that had written about it in the last 2 months. She hadn't sought out any of the coverage. Someone had written about it and sent her a link, and she'd read it once and felt strange about it and hadn't read it again. Because the thing being described, this woman, this diner, this story of a night in January, and 300 motorcycles sounded like someone else's life when she read about it, even though she knew it was hers. It was still hers. That was the thing that still surprised her quietly at various points throughout the day. Not the crowds, not the renovation, not the envelope under the counter or the photographs on the wall or Jack's name in her phone. What surprised her was the simpler thing beneath all of it, that she was still here. That she was still pouring coffee and calling orders to Danny and wiping down the counter between rushes and standing in this place she had built over 11 years out of stubbornness and conviction and the refusal to send anyone away empty. She was still here, and the place was still itself. That was the whole miracle when she reduced it to its core. Not the money or the renovation or the name on the sign. The miracle was that what she had always been, what this place had always been, had been worth saving. Had been worth 300 people riding through a blizzard. Had been worth an old man keeping his ring on his right hand for 13 years, and a young man choosing to live, and a woman from Chicago stopping instead of driving past. Danny came out of this kitchen at noon with 2 plates and set one in front of her without being asked. She looked at it, looked at him. You haven't eaten since 5 this morning, he said. Sit down. Danny, sit down, Emily. She sat down, she ate. And it was good, the same food she'd been making for 11 years, the same recipes, the same flavors. But it tasted different when someone else made it for you, when someone set it in front of you without you asking, when someone paid attention to the fact that you were running low on something and decided to do something about it before you had to ask. It tasted like what it was, like being seen, like being fed when you needed it. She understood, sitting on her own stool in her own diner with a plate that Danny had made for her because he was paying attention exactly what it had meant to all of them. Ghost and Cruz and Danny and Sandra and the woman from Chicago and every person who'd ever come through that door and left steadier than they'd arrived. She understood it from the inside now, which was different from understanding it from the other side of the counter. Both sides mattered. That was what 11 years and 1 January night had taught her. The giving and the receiving were the same act seen from different angles. You couldn't do one without eventually being asked to do the other. And the asking, when it came, the world turning around and offering back what you'd put into it, was not a reward. It wasn't karma or justice or the universe balancing its books. It was just the truth of things. That kindness traveled, that it found people, that it lived inside them for years and then one day came back 300 strong through a blizzard to stand in your parking lot and remind you that nothing you gave was ever lost. She finished her plate, set down her fork, looked at the diner full of lunch rush noise and warmth and the particular beautiful chaos of a place that was genuinely sustainably alive. Danny was back at their grill, The Idaho 3 had been replaced by two truckers and a family of four passing through on a road trip, the kids looking at the biker photographs on the wall with wide eyes. Shepard had left a tip, covered the family's lunch without knowing the family was coming, which was the kind of thing that happened in this place, now with a regularity that Emily no longer tried to explain. She put her apron back on, stood up, picked up the coffee pot. She did not pour with the efficiency of a woman going through the motions. She poured with the full attention of someone who understood that the act of pouring coffee for a stranger was not a small thing. Had never been a small thing, and would never be a small thing, regardless of how many times she did it, regardless of what the bank balance said, or what the sign outside read, or how many motorcycles were parked in her lot on any given morning. The world gives back what you put into it. Not always, not on a schedule you can predict or a timeline you'd choose, but it gives it back, with interest, with 300 engines at 5 in the morning, and a young man who chose to live, and an old man who kept writing, and a woman from Chicago who needed 1 inch of tension released by someone paying attention. Emily Carter poured coffee. She wore the same plain apron. She had the same tired blue eyes and the same gentle hands, and the same philosophy she'd carried through 11 years of doing this alone, in a diner that the world was supposed to have forgotten. The world had not forgotten. It never does when you give it something worth remembering.